February 19th, 1945, on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, a Japanese sergeant named Tadamichi Kuribayashi, no relation to the commanding general, sat in a reinforced concrete bunker 20 feet below the surface, listening to the sound of American naval bombardment shaking the earth above him. He had been underground for 3 days, ever since the American fleet had appeared on the horizon and begun the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history. The bunker he occupied was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, 8-foot-thick concrete walls, multiple sealed entrances connected by tunnels, ventilation shafts positioned to be invisible from above, and firing ports that could engage any enemy approaching up the beach, while remaining nearly impossible to suppress with conventional weapons. Sergeant Kuribayashi had helped build this fortification over the previous 6 months, and he knew its strengths intimately. The walls could withstand direct hits from naval artillery. The position was invisible to aerial reconnaissance. The interlocking fields of fire meant that no American could approach without being cut down. His commanding officer had told him that this bunker could hold out for weeks, maybe months, and that every day they delayed the Americans was a victory for the emperor. Kuribayashi believed this completely. He had good reason to believe it. The defensive system on Iwo Jima represented the most sophisticated fortification work the Japanese army had ever attempted, designed by experienced officers who had studied American tactics and prepared countermeasures for every weapon in the American arsenal. Or so they thought. What Sergeant Kuribayashi didn't know, as he sat in his concrete fortress listening to the bombardment, was that American Marines were about to introduce a weapon that would turn his invulnerable position into a tomb in less than 90 seconds. And the truly terrifying part was that the weapon had existed for years. Japanese intelligence knew it, existed, but no one had truly understood what it could do. Until they experienced it, to understand the shock that weapon delivered, you must first understand the philosophy that created the Japanese defensive positions on Iwo Jima. In early Pacific War battles, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Japanese forces had relied primarily on beachfront defenses and banzai charges, tactics that produced horrific casualties but ultimately failed to stop American advances. By 1944, Japanese military strategists had concluded that a new approach was needed. The man tasked with defending Iwo Jima was General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, an officer who had studied in America and understood industrial warfare better than most of his peers. He abandoned the doctrine of dying gloriously on the beaches and instead implemented a strategy of defense in depth, using fortified positions that would bleed the Americans over weeks of brutal fighting. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity: transform the entire island into a network of underground bunkers, tunnels, and fighting positions so thoroughly integrated that destroying one position would have no effect on the others. American Marines would have to root out each position individually, and every bunker cleared would cost American lives. The fortifications were engineering marvels, reinforced concrete structures built into natural caves, connected by 11 miles of tunnels, with stockpiles of ammunition, water, and supplies sufficient for months of combat. American intelligence officers who studied reconnaissance photographs before the invasion were genuinely concerned. A Marine colonel looking at the intelligence briefing maps reportedly said, "We're going to have to kill them in their holes, one at a time. And it's going to cost us everything." The Japanese soldiers manning those bunkers had been trained in a specific defensive doctrine. When American forces approached, defenders were to wait until the attackers were within 50 meters, then open fire with everything available: machine guns, rifles, grenades. If the Americans retreated, fine. If they took cover and tried to suppress the bunker with return fire, that was also fine. The concrete walls were impervious to rifle fire and could withstand even heavy machine gun fire indefinitely. If the Americans called in artillery or naval gunfire, The defenders would retreat deeper into the tunnels and wait out the bombardment, then return to their firing positions once it lifted. If the Americans tried to assault directly, they would be cut down in the open. The doctrine was sound, based on careful analysis of previous American tactics, and Japanese commanders were confident it would work. What they hadn't adequately prepared for, what they couldn't prepare for without experiencing it, was the combination of American combat, engineering, and a weapon that didn't rely on bullets or explosives to kill. The weapon was the M2 flamethrower, and to Japanese soldiers who first encountered it, the experience was so outside their framework of combat that initial reports were dismissed as panic or exaggeration. The M2 consisted of a backpack fuel tank containing 4 gallons of jellied gasoline, a pressurized nitrogen tank, and a nozzle with an igniter that could project burning fuel up to 40 meters. But those technical specifications couldn't capture what it was like to be on the receiving end. On the morning of February 20th, the second day of the Iwo Jima invasion, Sergeant Kuribayashi's bunker received its first test of American resolve. His position had already destroyed one American squad that had tried to advance up the beach. The interlocking machine gun fire had been devastatingly effective, exactly as doctrine predicted. The Americans had pulled back, and Kuribayashi could hear them calling to each other in English, words he didn't understand, but assumed were coordinating another assault or calling for artillery support. He wasn't worried. His bunker had already survived 2 direct hits from naval shells during the pre-invasion bombardment. Whatever the Americans threw at him next, the concrete would hold. What came next wasn't artillery. It was 5 Marines moving in a coordinated team, and they were carrying equipment Kuribayashi had never seen in combat. 2 Marines provided suppressing fire, keeping the Japanese defenders away from the firing ports. 2 more Marines carried satchel charges, heavy bags of explosives used to destroy fortifications, and the 5th Marine carried a cylindrical tank on his back connected to a wand-like nozzle. Kuribayashi watched through the firing port as this team approached, and he ordered his men to prepare to repel the assault. The Marines with satchel charges moved first, and Kuribayashi's machine gunner fired a burst that forced them to take cover. For a moment, it seemed like the defense was working exactly as planned. And then the Marine with the tank stepped around a rocky outcropping, pointed his nozzle directly at the firing port where Kuribayashi was watching, and pulled the trigger. What Sergeant Kuribayashi experienced in the next 5 seconds would alter his understanding of vulnerability in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. A stream of liquid fire erupted from the American weapon, arcing through the air with a strange, almost lazy trajectory, and then poured through the firing port like water through a funnel. But this wasn't water. It was burning gasoline that had been thickened into a gel that stuck to everything it touched. The liquid fire splashed against the interior wall of the bunker, and within 2 seconds, the entire front chamber was filled with flame. The heat was instant and overwhelming. Not the radiant heat of being near a fire, but the all-consuming heat of being inside one. Kuribayashi stumbled backward, his uniform smoldering, and heard his machine gunner screaming, a sound that lasted only moments before the flames consumed the oxygen in the sealed chamber. And the screaming stopped. The ventilation system that had been so carefully designed to protect against gas attack now worked in reverse, drawing smoke and flame deeper into the bunker complex. Men who were 30 feet from the initial breach began choking, their lungs seared by superheated air. And the fire kept burning, the jellied gasoline clinging to concrete and metal and flesh, impossible to extinguish with anything available in the bunker. What happened next took less than 90 seconds from the moment the flamethrower opened fire to the moment the last Japanese soldier in that bunker died. Some were killed by the flames directly. Others suffocated as the fire consumed the oxygen in the sealed space. A few tried to escape through the rear tunnel exits and were killed by American rifle fire as they emerged. Sergeant Kuribayashi survived longer than most. He made it to a sealed side chamber where the smoke was less dense, but the heat was still unbearable and the air was toxic. He lost consciousness, and whether he died from the heat, the toxic fumes, or the eventual explosion when the flames reached stored ammunition was never determined. His body was found 3 days later when American combat engineers explored the captured bunker complex. He was still clutching his rifle in a chamber where the rifle had been completely useless. The after-action reports from American units on Iwo Jima tell the story in cold, clinical language that somehow makes the horror more vivid. Bunker after bunker was engaged the same way. Suppress the firing ports, approach with engineers and flamethrower teams, and inject fire directly into the fortification. The typical time from first engagement to bunker neutralization was between 60 and 120 seconds. Not minutes or hours, but seconds. The concrete walls that could stop artillery shells were irrelevant against a weapon that didn't need to penetrate them. It simply poured through any opening and killed everything inside. The elaborate tunnel systems became death traps, channeling flame and smoke into spaces where men had nowhere to run. And the multiple sealed chambers that were supposed to provide fallback positions just created more rooms to die in. The fortification system that General Kuribayashi had spent months perfecting was being systematically dismantled by a weapon he'd known existed but had catastrophically underestimated: Japanese. Defensive doctrine had accounted for American artillery, aerial bombardment, naval gunfire, satchel charges, grenades, and even poison gas. There were gas masks stored in every bunker. But there was no defense against fire that burned so hot it consumed the air itself. You couldn't wear a gas mask because the heat would melt it. You couldn't stay in the bunker because you'd suffocate or burn. You couldn't retreat into the tunnels because the tunnels channeled the flames. And you couldn't surrender, not because of Japanese military code, though that was a factor, but because by the time most soldiers realized they wanted to surrender, they were already dying. The flamethrower didn't give you time to make decisions. It gave you time to die. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders who witnessed these attacks but survived them was devastating. A diary recovered from a Japanese officer on Iwo Jima included an entry from February 23rd that reads, "The Americans have a weapon that makes our strongest positions into ovens. Men are dying before they can fire a shot. The concrete walls we trusted are meaningless. I do not know how to fight this. I do not know if it can be fought." That phrase, "I do not know if it can be fought," represents a complete collapse of tactical confidence. These were soldiers who had been trained to die rather than surrender, who had endured the worst bombardments the American military could deliver, and who had believed their fortifications made them nearly invincible. The flamethrower took that confidence and incinerated it as thoroughly as it incinerated the men in the bunkers. But the shock wasn't limited to the immediate tactical situation. It was the realization of what American industrial capacity could do when applied to weapon development. The Japanese military had known about flamethrowers for years. They'd used primitive versions themselves in China, but those were heavy, unreliable devices with limited range, more useful for destroying equipment than as anti-personnel weapons. The American M2 flamethrower was a refined, mass-produced system that had been engineered with the same attention to reliability and effectiveness that Americans applied to every piece of military equipment. The jellied gasoline, napalm, was a chemical innovation that made the weapon far more effective than earlier liquid fuel versions. The portable tank system meant individual soldiers could carry and operate the weapon. And most terrifyingly, the Americans had built enough of them that every Marine rifle company had multiple flamethrower teams. This wasn't a rare, specialized weapon. It was standard issue. Japanese intelligence reports from prisoners captured later in the campaign revealed that Japanese commanders had assumed flamethrowers would be used occasionally, in specific situations against particularly stubborn bunkers. They never imagined they would become the primary method for clearing fortified positions, used dozens of times per day, by teams that had trained extensively in their employment. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days and cost nearly 7,000 American lives, one of the costliest battles in Marine Corps history. But Japanese casualties were even more severe. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island, fewer than 200 survived to be captured. The vast majority died in their bunkers and tunnels, and a significant percentage of those deaths were caused directly or indirectly by flamethrowers. The weapon that was supposed to be used occasionally became the dominant method of attack, and the fortification system that was supposed to make the island unconquerable was systematically burned out. Position by position, bunker by bunker, tunnel by tunnel, in the months after Iwo Jima, Japanese defensive doctrine underwent a desperate evolution. Orders went out to bunker designers to include multiple escape routes that couldn't be easily blocked, to avoid sealed chambers that could trap smoke, and to construct firing ports that could be quickly closed to prevent flame injection. But these modifications were band-aids on a fundamentally unsolvable problem. If you built a fortification strong enough to withstand American firepower, you created a confined space that was vulnerable to flame weapons. If you built a fortification with enough ventilation and escape routes to counter flame weapons, you created a structure too vulnerable to conventional attack. There was no design that could adequately defend against both, and the Americans had both. The Japanese army was being forced to choose which way they wanted to die, and neither option was acceptable. The most haunting assessment came from a post-war interview with a Japanese engineering officer who had helped design the Iwo Jima fortifications. When asked what he would have done differently, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "We designed those bunkers to withstand anything we could imagine. But we couldn't imagine what the Americans would do because we were thinking like soldiers, and they were thinking like exterminators. They didn't try to penetrate our defenses. They just burned out the interior like clearing insects from a house." Once I understood that, I realized there was nothing I could have designed that would have worked. You cannot fortify against industrial efficiency applied to killing. That was the essence of the shock, not just the weapon itself, but what it represented about American military thinking. Japanese doctrine was built on courage, endurance, and spiritual strength. American doctrine was built on identifying problems and engineering solutions, then producing those solutions in overwhelming quantities. The flamethrower was American warfare distilled to its essence. Find the most efficient method to neutralize the enemy. Turn it into a reliable tool, manufacture it by the thousands, and train men to use it systematically. There was no glory in it, no bushido, no tradition. Just industrial-scale efficiency applied to the problem of killing people in fortified positions. And against that approach, courage and concrete were equally useless. The M2 flamethrower remained in American service for decades after World War II, used in Korea, Vietnam, and other conflicts. But its psychological peak was Iwo Jima, where it transformed a battle that could have lasted months into a 5-week ordeal. The bunkers that were supposed to be impregnable tombs for attackers became exactly that, but for the defenders instead. Sergeant Kuribayashi died in his perfect fortress, protected by 8 feet of concrete, killed by a weapon that simply ignored all that protection and burned him alive in the place he'd been told he was safest. And across the island, in bunker after bunker, tunnel after tunnel, thousands of his comrades died the same way, discovering too late that the strongest walls mean nothing when the enemy doesn't need to break through them. He just needs to pour fire through the cracks and wait for the screaming to stop.